At 2:47 on the morning of December 27, 1941, Lieutenant William Harrison crouched behind a snow-covered boulder on the Norwegian coast, his fingers wrapped around the grip of a medieval longbow, while German sentries patrolled less than 30 yards ahead. The wind carried their voices across the frozen landscape, and Harrison knew that in less than 3 minutes, 200 men would either live or die based on what he did next. If you're fascinated by the most unconventional warriors of World War II, hit that like button and subscribe, because this is the story of a man they called insane until the night his madness became genius. William Harrison was born in Surrey, England in 1906, the son of a retired Army colonel who had served in the Boer War and the Great War. From childhood, Harrison was obsessed with medieval history, spending hours in his father's library reading about Agincourt, Crécy, and the Scottish Wars of Independence. While other boys played cricket, young William practiced archery in the family estate's grounds, eventually becoming a champion archer at the county level by age 16. His father, a practical military man, tolerated this eccentric hobby but insisted his son pursue a proper military career. Harrison obliged, entering Sandhurst in 1926, but he never abandoned his fascination with the weapons and tactics of centuries past. By 1939, Harrison was a lieutenant in the Manchester Regiment, respected for his competence but quietly mocked for his peculiarities. He had purchased a Scottish claymore sword from an antique dealer in Edinburgh and kept it polished and sharp in his quarters. His brother officers found this amusing, a harmless affectation from an otherwise capable young officer. When war broke out in September 1939, Harrison requested transfer to a more active role, frustrated by the months of inaction during the phony war. His request was denied twice. The third time, in early 1940, he wrote directly to his regimental commander, "Sir, I did not join His Majesty's forces to sit in a trench waiting for the enemy to choose the time and place. If the army will not use me, perhaps I should seek employment elsewhere." The letter worked, though not in the way Harrison expected. In June 1940, after the disaster at Dunkirk and the fall of France, Churchill's government began forming special units for raids and unconventional warfare. The Commandos were born from desperation and rage, volunteers drawn from every regiment, trained to strike fast and hard at German-occupied Europe. Harrison volunteered immediately. During his interview, the recruiting officer asked about his hobbies. Harrison mentioned archery. The officer, a veteran of the trenches in 1916, laughed. "Planning to shoot the Jerrys with arrows, Lieutenant?" Harrison looked at him without smiling. "If it works, sir, yes." Something in his tone made the officer stop laughing. Harrison was accepted. Training at Achnacarry in the Scottish Highlands was brutal. Commandos learned cliff climbing, silent killing, boat handling, demolitions, and navigation in hostile terrain. Harrison excelled at all of it, but he also did something that baffled his instructors and fellow trainees. He brought his longbow and practiced with it every evening after the day's exercises were complete. Men exhausted from 14-hour days would see Harrison on the archery range, loosing arrow after arrow at targets 50, 70, 90 yards away, his form perfect, his focus absolute. Some thought it was a stress reliever, an odd way to unwind. Others thought he was losing his grip on reality. His troop sergeant, a Glaswegian named McGregor who had survived Dunkirk, finally asked him one night what the hell he thought he was doing. Harrison drew another arrow, nocked it, and let it fly. It struck the center of a target 80 yards distant. "Sergeant," he said, "a rifle shot alerts every enemy within 500 yards. An arrow makes almost no sound. If I can put one through a man's throat at 70 yards, I can kill a sentry without waking his comrades." "Tell me that's not useful." McGregor stared at him, then at the target, then back at Harrison. "You're either a genius or completely mad, sir." Harrison smiled for the first time in weeks. Perhaps both. In November 1940, Harrison participated in his first raid, a small operation against German positions on the French coast near Boulogne. It was a disaster. Poor intelligence, bad weather, and alert German defenders turned the raid into a bloody shambles. Harrison's section was pinned down on a beach for 3 hours under machine gun fire before they could withdraw. 5 men died, including the section's commanding officer. Harrison took command, kept his men together, and got them back to the boats. He did not fire his longbow that night. There had been no opportunity, and the chaos of combat had been nothing like the neat tactical scenarios he had envisioned. That night, back in England, Harrison sat alone in the barracks, his bow across his knees, and wondered if McGregor had been right, if he was simply mad, clinging to romantic nonsense while modern war slaughtered men by the thousands. But he did not put the bow away. Through the winter and spring of 1941, Harrison went on 3 more raids, 2 in Norway, 1 in the Channel Islands. On the second Norwegian raid in March, his moment came. His troop had landed on a rocky shore before dawn, tasked with destroying a German coastal radar station. The approach required crossing 200 yards of open ground, and German sentries were posted at intervals. Harrison's commanding officer, a captain named Winters, planned to use suppressed Sten guns to eliminate the sentries. But the Stens were notoriously unreliable, prone to jamming, and even suppressed, they made noise, a metallic cough that could carry on still air. Harrison spoke up during the briefing. "Sir, let me take the first sentry with the bow." Winters looked at him like he had suggested using a catapult. "Harrison, this is not the bloody Middle Ages." Harrison kept his voice steady. "Sir, I can kill him silently from 70 yards. The wind is in our favor. If I miss, your Sten team is still in position. But if I succeed, we maintain complete silence for the approach." Winters stared at him for a long moment, then sighed. "One chance, Harrison. You miss, and I'm confiscating that damn bow." At 0430 hours, Harrison lay prone on a ridge overlooking the radar station, his longbow beside him. The sentry stood near a supply shed, smoking a cigarette, his rifle slung over his shoulder. 73 yards, Harrison estimated, accounting for the slight downward angle. The wind was calm, perhaps 2 miles per hour from the west. Cold, but not cold enough to affect the bow's draw weight significantly. Harrison's heart hammered in his chest. He had done this 1,000 times at targets, at straw dummies, at painted silhouettes, never at a living man. He thought about the men behind him, depending on him. He thought about the families in the villages below, living under occupation. He thought about the 5 men who had died on that beach at Boulogne, because the mission had failed. He drew the bow, feeling the familiar resistance of yew wood, the feathers of the arrow brushing his cheek. He exhaled slowly, aimed for the center of mass, adjusted for the wind and released. The arrow flew in near silence, a whisper of displaced air. It struck the German sentry in the chest, punching through his winter coat and into his heart. The man dropped without a sound, the cigarette falling from his lips. For 3 seconds, nobody moved. Then Winters, crouched 10 yards behind Harrison, whispered, "Jesus Christ, he actually did it." The raid proceeded in total silence. The commandos reached the radar station, planted their explosives, and withdrew without firing a shot. The Germans never knew they had been there until the charges detonated 15 minutes after the commandos had left the shore. On the boat back to England, Winters clapped Harrison on the shoulder. "I owe you an apology, Lieutenant. That was the maddest thing I've ever seen work." Harrison said nothing, but his hands were shaking. He had killed a man with a weapon from the year 1415. The disconnect between method and reality made him feel unmoored, as if he had torn a hole in time itself. Word spread. The lieutenant who used a longbow in combat became a story, then a legend, then a joke, depending on who was telling it. Senior officers considered him a dangerous eccentric. Fellow commandos thought he was either brilliant or insane, sometimes both in the same conversation. Harrison himself struggled with what he had done. He believed deeply in the ideals of chivalry, in honor and courage, in the notion that war should be fought between soldiers, face to face, man to man. But modern warfare had become impersonal and industrial, fought with artillery that killed men who never saw their enemy, with bombers that incinerated cities from 20,000 feet, with machines that turned human beings into statistics. Harrison's bow was his protest against that impersonality, his attempt to restore some measure of individual skill and courage to combat. But he knew, in his darkest moments, that it was also a fantasy. The war did not care about his ideals. It killed indiscriminately, and his bow, for all its silence and elegance, was still a tool for putting men in the ground. In late November 1941, Harrison was summoned to a briefing in London. Operation Archery was taking shape, a large-scale raid on the Lofoten Islands off the northern coast of Norway. The islands were strategically valuable, hosting fish oil factories that supplied glycerin for German explosives, and a small German garrison. The plan called for 500 commandos, supported by naval gunfire and air cover, to land on multiple beaches, destroy the factories, capture German personnel for intelligence, and evacuate Norwegian volunteers who wanted to join the Free Norwegian forces. Harrison's troop would land at Stamsund, a fishing village on the southern shore, where intelligence suggested a German command post and ammunition depot were located. The briefing officer emphasized the importance of surprise. If the Germans were alerted before the commandos landed, the entire operation could collapse into a bloodbath. Harrison studied the maps and aerial photographs. The approach to Stamsund required crossing open ground from the beach to the village, roughly 300 yards, with German observation posts on the hills above. Sentries would be posted at intervals. Even with surprise, the first minutes would be critical. If the Germans raised the alarm, their reinforcements could arrive from the main garrison at Svolvær within 20 minutes, trapping the commandos against the sea. Harrison saw the problem immediately. Suppressed weapons would not be enough. The Germans would have radios, alarm bells, flares. Even a few seconds of warning could cost hundreds of lives. He raised his hand. "Sir, what's the protocol for eliminating sentries during the approach?" The briefing officer, a major from Combined Operations, looked annoyed at the interruption. "Suppressed stens, knives if necessary." "Why?" Harrison hesitated, then said, "Sir, I'd like permission to use a longbow for the initial approach. It's silent, effective at range, and—" The major cut him off. "Lieutenant, this is a modern military operation, not a medieval reenactment. You'll use standard-issue weapons." Harrison opened his mouth to argue, but Winters, sitting beside him, touched his arm and shook his head. After the briefing, Winters pulled Harrison aside. "Bring the bow anyway. If the situation calls for it, I'll back you. But for God's sake, don't make me regret this." The commandos departed from Scapa Flow on December 24, 1941. Christmas at sea, heading toward occupied Norway on destroyers that sliced through black water under a moonless sky. Harrison stood on deck, the wind cutting through his woolen coat, and watched the stars. Around him, men checked their weapons, wrote letters they would leave on the ship, smoked cigarettes, and tried to sleep. Harrison's bow was wrapped in oilcloth and stowed in his pack, along with 24 arrows, each one carefully inspected, each fletching perfect. He also carried his claymore strapped across his back, the blade sharpened to a razor edge. Some of the men still mocked him for it, but quietly now and with less conviction. They had heard the stories from Norway. They knew that Harrison's madness had kept men alive. At 06:30 hours on December 27th, the landing craft hit the beaches at Stamsund. The water was freezing, the shore lined with rocks and patches of snow. Harrison's section moved inland fast, weapons ready, every man acutely aware that surprise was everything. The village was still dark, the German garrison apparently unaware. But as Harrison's section approached the first rise, he saw the problem. 2 sentries on a ridge 300 yards ahead, silhouetted against the lightening sky. They were positioned to overlook the beach and the approach routes. If they saw the commandos and raised the alarm, the entire operation would be compromised. Winters saw them too. He cursed under his breath, then turned to Harrison. "Can you do it? Both of them?" Harrison assessed the range, the light, the wind. 80 yards to the first sentry, 95 to the second. Uphill in dim light, with cold fingers. He had made harder shots on the range, but never in combat, never with lives depending on it. He met Winters' eyes. "Yes, sir." Winters nodded. "Do it." Harrison moved forward alone, crawling through the snow until he had a clear line of sight. His hands were numb, his breath misting in the frigid air. He unwrapped the bow, nocked an arrow, and drew. The first sentry was standing still, facing away, his rifle cradled in his arms. Harrison aimed for the upper back, between the shoulder blades. If he hit the spine, the man would drop silently. He released. The arrow flew true, striking the sentry exactly where Harrison had aimed. The man collapsed forward into the snow without a sound. The second sentry, 20 yards away, turned at the movement, confused. Harrison already had another arrow nocked. He drew, aimed, and fired in less than 3 seconds. The second arrow took the sentry in the throat. He fell backward, his rifle clattering on the rocks. For a moment, Harrison was certain the noise would alert the Germans below, but the wind was rising, masking the sound, and no alarm came. Harrison waved his section forward. They moved past the bodies, and Harrison saw the faces of the dead men, young and frightened even in death. He felt nothing in that moment, only the cold clarity of survival. The section reached the German command post at 07:15 hours. The building was a converted schoolhouse, now flying a swastika flag. Inside, German officers were at breakfast, unaware that British commandos were 30 feet away. Winters signaled for the assault. Harrison kicked in the door, his Sten gun ready, but what happened next became legend. As German soldiers scrambled for their weapons, Harrison dropped the Sten, drew his claymore, and charged into the room, roaring like a berserker from 1,000 years ago. The shock was total. The Germans, confronted by a British officer wielding a medieval sword and screaming like a madman, hesitated for a critical second. That second was enough. Harrison's blade cut down 2 men before they could fire. The rest of the section poured in behind him, and the fight was over in less than 30 seconds. 12 Germans dead or wounded, 4 captured, and the command post secured. But Harrison's sword stroke had severed a radio cable, preventing the Germans from sending a distress signal. That accident, combined with the silent elimination of the sentries, meant the main German garrison at Svolvær had no idea Stamsund had been taken. For the next 4 hours, Harrison's section held the command post while other commando units destroyed the fish oil factories and rounded up Norwegian volunteers. At 11:20 hours, a runner arrived with urgent news. A German relief column, estimated at 200 infantry with armored cars, was approaching from Svolvær. They would reach Stamsund in less than 30 minutes. The problem was brutal. The commandos' withdrawal to the beaches had already begun. If the German column reached the village before the evacuation was complete, they would catch the commandos in the open, massacring them as they tried to board the landing craft. Winters faced an impossible choice: retreat immediately and abandon 100 men still in the village, or hold the command post and try to delay the Germans. Both options meant heavy casualties. Harrison looked at the map, then at the approach road. An idea began to form, mad and desperate. He turned to Winters. "Sir, give me 10 men in 30 minutes. I can delay them." Winters stared at him. "How?" Harrison pointed to a narrow defile where the road passed between 2 hills. "Ambush. We can block the road, hit them from above, force them to deploy. Even if we can't stop them, we can slow them down long enough for the withdrawal." Winters shook his head. "Harrison, that's suicide. 200 Germans against 11 men. Harrison's voice was calm. "Sir, 200 men die here if we do nothing. 10 men might die if we try. The math is simple." Winters closed his eyes, his face gray with exhaustion and fear. Then he nodded. "Go. God help you." Harrison took 10 volunteers, all of them knowing they might not return. They ran to the defile carrying what explosives they had left, extra ammunition, and grenades. Harrison also carried his bow and a dozen arrows. They had 23 minutes before the German column arrived. The commandos set charges at the narrowest point of the road, rigged to collapse the hillside and block vehicles. They positioned themselves on both sides of the defile, hidden among the rocks, with overlapping fields of fire. Harrison placed himself at the far end, where he could see the approach. At 11:47 hours, the German column came into view. Trucks, armored cars, infantry marching in formation. Professional soldiers, alert and ready. Harrison waited until the lead vehicle was 50 yards from the defile. Then he stood, drew his bow, and fired. The arrow struck the driver of the lead truck through the windshield. The truck swerved, crashed into a ditch, and blocked the road. Chaos erupted. The Germans scrambled for cover, firing wildly at the hillsides. Harrison's men detonated the charges, and the hillside collapsed, burying 2 vehicles and cutting off the front of the column from the rear. Then the commandos opened fire with everything they had: rifles, Stens, grenades. The confined space turned into a killing ground. Germans fell, vehicles burned, and for 9 minutes 11 British commandos held 200 German soldiers at bay. But the Germans were professionals. They flanked the ambush, climbing the hills on both sides, and began to close the trap. Harrison knew they had minutes, maybe seconds. He shouted the order to withdraw. The commandos broke contact, running back toward the village in a fighting retreat. 3 men died covering the withdrawal, cut down by German fire. Harrison was the last to leave, firing his Sten until it jammed, then drawing his claymore and holding the trail while his men escaped. A German soldier rushed him with a bayonet. Harrison parried, struck, and the man fell. Another came, and Harrison's blade found his throat. But there were too many. Harrison turned to run and felt a sledgehammer blow to his left shoulder. He had been shot. He stumbled, nearly fell, but kept moving. Behind him, the Germans were regrouping, preparing to pursue. Harrison reached the village at 1204 hours, blood soaking his uniform, his vision graying at the edges. Winters grabbed him, dragged him toward the beach. "You mad bastard, you did it. The last boats are loading now." Harrison tried to speak, but the pain was overwhelming. He passed out as they carried him to the landing craft. The evacuation was completed at 12:17 hours. The German column, delayed by Harrison's ambush and cautious of further traps, did not reach the beach until 12:30, by which time the commandos were a mile offshore, covered by naval gunfire. Operation Archery was a complete success. All objectives achieved, over 300 Norwegian volunteers evacuated, significant German casualties inflicted, minimal British losses. Of the 214 commandos and Norwegian personnel who would have been trapped on the beach without Harrison's delaying action, all but 7 survived. The 7 who died were the 3 men lost in the ambush, and 4 others killed in earlier fighting. Harrison's lunatic plan had worked. His medieval tactics, combined with modern explosives and small unit discipline, had saved nearly 200 lives. Harrison woke up in a field hospital in Scotland 3 days later. The bullet had shattered his collarbone but missed the major arteries. He would recover, though his left arm would never have full strength again. Winters visited him, bringing news and a message from the commanding officer of Combined Operations. Harrison was being recommended for the Military Cross for his actions at Stamsund. Winters sat beside the bed and said quietly, "You know, Harrison, I thought you were insane. Maybe you are. But you're the kind of insane the Army needs." Harrison tried to smile, but the morphine made everything distant and strange. "Did we save them? All of them?" Winters nodded. "All but 7. Because of you." Harrison closed his eyes. 7 dead, 200 saved. The arithmetic of war, cold and final. He thought about the German sentries he had killed with arrows, the officers he had cut down with his claymore, the soldiers who had died in the ambush. He had killed perhaps 20 men in a single day, using weapons from 3 different centuries. The modernity of slaughter married to the intimacy of medieval combat. It made him feel sick. Harrison returned to duty in March 1942, but his shoulder injury kept him from frontline combat. He was assigned to training duties, teaching Commando recruits the principles of silent approach, ambush tactics, and improvisation. He no longer carried his bow or claymore in the field, though he kept them in his quarters, oiled and maintained. Some said the injury had ended his madness. Others said the madness had simply changed form. Harrison trained hundreds of men over the next 3 years. and dozens of them credited his unorthodox methods with keeping them alive in combat. He never spoke about Stamsund except in tactical terms, never mentioned the men he had killed, never discussed the nightmares that woke him most nights, sweating and shaking. The war ended in May 1945. Harrison was 39 years old, a major, decorated with the Military Cross and mentioned in dispatches 3 times. He returned to England and tried to resume civilian life, but it was impossible. The skills that had made him exceptional in war, the ability to kill without hesitation, to make brutal calculations, to suppress fear and doubt, were useless and disturbing in peace. He took a position teaching history at a secondary school in Kent, but he lasted only 2 years. The boys reminded him too much of the young soldiers he had trained, the young Germans he had killed. In 1948, he resigned and moved to a small cottage in the Scottish Highlands, as far from people as he could manage. He hunted, fished, and practiced archery alone in the hills. Visitors were rare and unwelcome. His only regular contact was with a few former commandos who would visit once or twice a year, and they would drink whiskey and talk about everything except the war. In 1963, a military historian researching Commando operations tracked Harrison down and asked to interview him about Operation Archery. Harrison refused at first, but the historian was persistent, and eventually Harrison agreed to one meeting. The historian asked about the bow, about the ambush, about how it felt to use medieval weapons in modern combat. Harrison was silent for a long time. Then he said, "I thought I was restoring honor to war. I thought that by fighting face to face with skill and courage, I was doing something noble. But there is no honor in killing. There is only necessity and consequence. I killed men with arrows because it was silent and effective. I killed men with a sword because it was faster than reloading. And I would do it all again, because the alternative was letting my men die. But don't romanticize it. I was a killer in a war full of killers, and the weapon doesn't change that." The historian published excerpts of the interview in a military journal, and for a brief time, Harrison's story resurfaced in British military circles. Some called him a hero. Others called him a relic of a bygone age. Harrison ignored all of it. He died in 1974 at the age of 68 of a heart attack while hiking in the Highlands. He was found 3 days later by a sheep farmer, his body lying in a meadow overlooking a glen, his old longbow beside him. He had been practicing. There was no funeral, only a quiet cremation as specified in his will. His ashes were scattered in the Highlands by 2 former commandos, neither of whom spoke during the ceremony. The claymore and longbow were donated to the Imperial War Museum, where they remain on display with a small plaque. Weapons carried by Major William Harrison, MC, during Commando operations in World War II. The plaque does not mention Stamsund, or the 200 men he saved, or the fact that he killed enemy soldiers with a weapon from the 15th century. Most visitors walk past the display without a second glance, assuming it is some kind of historical curiosity, a quirk of the war. Only occasionally does a veteran stop, read the plaque carefully, and nod in recognition. The story of William Harrison raises uncomfortable questions about the nature of modern warfare and the individuals who fight in it. In an age of bombers, tanks, and mechanized slaughter, Harrison tried to impose a personal code of honor and skill onto combat, using weapons that emphasized individual ability rather than industrial firepower. But his success at Stamsund was not a rejection of modernity. It was a synthesis of old and new, using medieval silence and shock to enable modern tactics. His madness was really a kind of lateral thinking, a refusal to accept that the only way to fight was the conventional way. And yet Harrison himself never found peace in what he had done. He saved lives, but he also took them. And the method, whether arrow, sword, or bullet, did not ease the weight of those deaths. History remembers victories and defeats, campaigns and casualties, the grand sweep of armies across continents. But history is made of individuals, each one carrying their own fear, doubt, courage, and trauma. William Harrison was one man among millions, and his story would have been lost entirely if not for a few surviving commandos and one persistent historian. How many others fought with equal courage and creativity and left no trace? How many made impossible choices in the chaos of combat and died before anyone could record what they had done? The numbers in history books, 200 men saved, 20 men killed, are abstractions. Behind each number is a face, a name, a life cut short or extended by seconds and inches. Harrison understood this. It is why he could never speak comfortably about what he had done, why he spent his final years alone in the highlands, why he died with his bow beside him, still trying to perfect a skill that no longer had any purpose except to remind him of who he had been. If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe for more forgotten heroes of World War II. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and whether someone in your family served in any war. Their stories, like Harrison's, deserve to be remembered, not just as statistics or legends, but as human beings who faced impossible choices and lived with the consequences. History is not made by nations or ideologies. It is made by individuals, and every one of them matters.